Hello everybody. We're going to be continuing the Infinite Jest video series, and we will be starting on page 65, and the chapter title is Denver, Colorado, November 1st, Year of the Depend Adult Undergarment. And in this chapter we're following Orrin and Cadenza again. This is Hal's brother, and we get a little bit of insight into his pre-game routine. And so, what he is essentially doing along with his teammates is he's dressing up like a bird, and he gets to the top of the stadium and then makes this kind of show of flying down to the actual football field. And so keep in mind he is from Arizona, so presumably he's an Arizona Cardinal, which would explain why he's dressed up like a bird. And you can tell that Orrin is not really enjoying this aspect of his job because he talks about how hands in the top row are reaching and clutching, people laughing. So it's clear to me that this isn't just joy from the people. It also seems a little bit like they're laughing at them and not with the players. And he even talks about how he refuses to whistle or squawk like a bird, showing that he really just is kind of doing this against his will. And he has one really important line in this short chapter, which is, "I'm not a freak show performer." And that's really important because in the last video, when we were going through the whole list of James and Cadenza, so Orrin and Hal and Cadenza's father, going through his list of movies, he had one movie that I mentioned where basically all of these people were watching these other individuals do really degrading acts, and because these people were doing degrading acts, it was so entertaining that the audience turned into giant eyeballs. So this definitely seems like the degrading act that Orrin has to perform in order to entertain the crowd. And also, you can kind of tell that the crowd is just turning into eyeballs because they just are trying to be entertained and they're just trying to take it all in. It's also entertaining to them. And so that's basically all from that chapter, which is a very short chapter, but it's kind of interesting to think that in this universe we're discussing of Infinite Jest, that there are still football games. Something about that's kind of bizarre to me because there's just so much discord throughout the novel that it's interesting that football is still a concept. So now we get into this next chapter. It doesn't have a chapter title, it just has the little annular ring. And so we start off with Michael Pimulus, and he's kind of the drug expert at ETA, and he's having kind of a funny scene where he's meeting with his kind of younger group within ETA that he is basically kind of a big buddy, big brother mentor to them. And he's just spouting off about different psychedelic mushrooms, essentially. And, he's basically just saying, going into, the chemical composition of these psychedelic drugs and the symptoms of ingesting these psychedelic drugs. And, some of the kids are listening and others are just kind of, it mentions one boy probes at his own navel. So it's just kind of funny to me that Michael Pemulus is so able to be so open about drugs at ETA, and no one says, "Hey, you can't say that." Um, but this simple, short um, section leads up to um, an important section with Hal. And so Hal is talking about how some of the earlier, some players will start drugs very early, such as age 12. And he talks about because of his own father's issue and also his father's father with different drugs, he didn't start Bob Hope or marijuana until he was 15. And he said that he basically started smoking weed when he needed help to sleep. So he said as a Sominex, basically just a sleeping aid. And then he says finally he kept using the drugs all the way through a really unpleasant dream that had been recurring nightly. And so basically, Hal justified his initial drug use by by the thought that it would fill a purpose in his life, and the purpose being that he needed to go to sleep. And it just so happened to be that the drugs also solved another problem, which is his nightmares. So, what is the nightmare he talks about? So, I actually thought that maybe this could be referring to that earlier chapter where Hal is looking throughout his room and he sees a face in the floor, but it goes on to immediately start talking about a different dream. In this dream, he's basically imagining himself in a tennis match, except the size of the tennis court is the size of a football field. So it's about 2 or 3 times as big. And he can't really see the opponent on the other side. And he says the reason he can't see the opponent on the other side is just because there's too much in between him and the net, let alone him and the opponent. And he has, lots, he says the whole thing is almost too involved to try to take in all at once. It's simply huge. And so also he mentions that his mom is on the side, basically holding her fist upright in solidarity. And he says we sort of play, but everything is theoretical, and he can't see the distant opponent because of all the apparatus involved with the game. So I think that this being juxtaposed with the earlier section of Michael Pimulus talking about drugs means that this is obviously a dream metaphor. But how I interpret this is that the opponent on the other side is his drug addiction, or really, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and the apparatus of the game is basically everything in his life, whether it be the excuses he uses that it's a sleep aid, or that the excuse he uses that he's only smoking weed to stop these nightmares, when in reality, perhaps these nightmares began with the drug use. And of course, the nightmare where you have to battle drug addiction would be obviously tied to doing drugs. And so that's how I interpret that sequence. And as far as Hal's mom being on the sidelines with unconditional support, what I think that means is that earlier in a previous chapter, it's clear that Avril knows that her underage son is drinking. And she's against it for sure, but she allows it to go on. And the reason being is that she doesn't want to be an overbearing mother. And as a single mom, she wants to still be that source of parent to Hal and doesn't want to lose that connection. But keep in mind that Hal's father and Hal's father all had drinking problems. And so in reality, Avril, just by knowing Hal and his opponent, drug addiction, she basically is watching the game. And she has unconditional support for Hal, but all she is doing is watching. And of course, she doesn't actually know that Hal is not only dabbling in alcohol, but also in weed, which she doesn't know about. Okay, so that's that chapter. So obviously, we got a lot about drugs here. And we then go into a new chapter, Year of the Dependent Adult Undergarment, where we're following Kate, or Catherine Gompert, and she is in a psych ward. So we've been basically in a psych ward before with Hal in the first chapter, but keep in mind that was the year of GLAD. So this is not even the same year. So there's really no chance that incident and this incident have any overlap. But she is in a very depressed state, and she just had a recent suicide attempt where she said she took 110 Parnate, about 30 lithanate capsules, and some old Zoloft. So these are basically neuromodulatory drugs. And she, instead of taking them like she was supposed to, she just took them all at once. And this is kind of another example of, these drugs which are thought to help you can actually hurt you, right? And that goes back to Hal, which he thought the weed could help him with the sleeping problem, but it actually hurt him. And so we have this, the situation is very similar here. And she describes a little bit about what happened when she was overdosing on these drugs. And it's kind of interesting because on page 70, she says her mom hallucinated me as a newborn again, on my side, all red and wet. And remember, this is the year of the dependent adult undergarment. So as we've been mentioning throughout, this is the adult baby. So she's basically saying that her mom thought she was a newborn, which is a very clear connection between the adult baby idea we've had going with the year of the dependent adult undergarment and seeing someone who is overdosing as a baby. And so there's definitely some connection there. And then she basically talks about her depression and the doctors basically trying to continue a productive conversation to learn what's wrong with Kate Gompert. And she has an issue with the MD saying that it sounds like depression because she says on page 73, that's what you guys want to call it, I guess. And she kind of is against this title of depression because she thinks that it's some kind of where you're just kind of mopey and you're just lying around and you're window sighing, which means, you look out the window, just go, but, she says it's like horror more than sadness. It's more like horror, which when I read that, what it reminds me of is Hal's first dream, when Hal was looking for that face on the floor and he found it. And just the horror of knowing it's there, that it's that evil is always with you. And so I think that there is some kind of similarity between the emotions of Kate Gompert's depression, or whatever you call it. This feeling is what she ends up calling it, and what Hal is feeling. And keep in mind, that was when Hal was 12. So this is many years before a year of the dependent adult undergarment, the year of this chapter. So she has a really nice quote, which I'm going to read, even though it's lengthy, because it's just really nice. So she's talking about how her feeling feels. And she says, like every cell and every atom or brain cell or whatever was so nauseous it wanted to throw up. But it couldn't. And you felt that way all the time, and you're positive the feeling will never go away. You're going to spend the rest of your natural life feeling like this. And, that's just, for someone who is obviously not in a correct state, the fear that it's always going to be like this is just a crushing one. And I think that has a lot to do, that quote has a lot to do with addiction as well, which is when you're addicted to something, you feel like you will always be addicted to a drug. And so she basically then goes on to say that she thinks that some of her feeling she has to do with Bob Hope, which is marijuana. And she she actually talks a little bit about um, was basically there's a section in here where they talk about classic unipolars, which would basically be someone with depression, whereas if you're on both poles, you'd be bipolar. Um, and the doctor says classic unipolars were usually tormented by the conviction that no one else could hear or understand them when they tried to communicate. Hence, jokes, sarcasm, the psychopathology of unconscious arm rubbing. So, this being tormented by the inability to communicate, that very clearly has to do with himself, as in James Incandenza, Hal's dad. And so, this suggests to me, and rightly so, that Hal's dad was probably depressed. That is evident throughout a wide body of evidence, but it's a clear connection here, which is thinking that you're not communicating with somebody. So that's definitely a clear reference to the dad. But so back to Kate Gompert. Sorry, that was a bit of an aside. So Kate Gompert says the problem with her depression is she stops taking the drugs. It's not taking the drug, it's stopping. And so she has this cycle she describes where she uses drugs and then she gets to the point where she's not functioning anymore. So she's skipping work. Anytime she has a break from work, she's smoking weed. And so it's very similar to Ken Erdedy in that earlier chapter where he's waiting for that woman to arrive to give him weed, right? So he took time off work to smoke weed. And a very similar idea is happening with Kate Gompert. Now, after a while, she realized that drugs are wrecking her life, and so she stops. She says she really does stop. But the problem is that what happens is that this depression sets in, and she kind of feels like it's just creeping in at first, but then it starts to, invade every crevice of her life. This feeling of depression, and the only way she can kind of fix this in her mind is the weed. And so you can see how this is cyclical, right? The drugs fix a solution, and then when that solution is fixed, you stop it, and then that problem comes back again, and then you do the drugs, and then so you see how we're making a circle here. This is kind of the annular idea, or the ring-like idea we have going on here, which is the problem has so basically that the drug states it will fix something when it actually creates the problem. That's the circularity of it all. And so she tries to break this cycle of drugs and weaning yourself off the drugs and the depression by suicide. And so that is essentially her wanting a way out of this cyclical pattern and to not do the drugs again. But you can tell that her options are really dire. It's either continue the cycle again of addiction and withdrawal, or to end it completely by suicide. And at the end of this chapter, it's really unclear what solution there is for Kate Gompert. She asks to be put into a month-long coma, as if that would really help her. And then she also says, you could give me the electroconvulsive therapy as a way to help her out. And I think that these ideas elucidate the fact that people with addiction oftentimes have a hard time of actually addressing the root problem. Keep in mind, that same idea goes back to Hal's dream, where he's playing an unknown opponent who's probably addiction, And he says he doesn't even know where to serve the ball because of all the apparatus of the game. And so Hal, Michael Pemulus, and Kate Gompert all are dealing with this cycle of addiction. And, you know, it's just all too complicated for them to really hone into what the issue is. And that kind of keeps the cycle going. So, with that note, we're going to end on page 78. This isn't actually a chapter break, but it's about the normal page length I stop, and we'll get to the next chapter next time. All right, thank you.